You ever wake up and find out someone else decided your property belongs to them? That was the first thought that crossed my mind the morning everything changed. And if you had asked me the night before whether something like that could happen in America, I would have laughed. My name is Daniel Carter, and until that Tuesday, my biggest concern was whether the bass in my pond would still be biting after a week of summer heat. My family had owned that land outside Millbrook for 23 years. The pond wasn't decorative. It wasn't some neighborhood feature built by a developer for everyone to enjoy. It sat entirely inside my property line, surrounded by old maple trees my father planted before I ever had gray hair. My kids learned to fish there. My wife and I celebrated anniversaries on the small dock overlooking the water. Every tax bill I had ever paid included that pond. Every survey I had ever received showed the exact same boundaries. There had never been a single question about who owned it. Until that morning. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee expecting another quiet sunrise, but instead I froze halfway across my porch. Bright white fencing stretched across the entrance to my gravel path. Fresh metal posts had been driven into the ground overnight. Hanging from the center was a brand new green sign that read, HOA Community Area. At first I honestly thought someone was filming a prank video. I looked around for cameras. I even smiled for a second because the whole thing seemed too ridiculous to be real. Then I noticed the heavy chain wrapped around my own gate. Someone had actually locked me out of my own pond. I walked down the driveway expecting to find contractors who had made some unbelievable mistake, but there wasn't a single worker in sight. Instead, I found 3 neighbors standing near the fence reading the sign like it had always belonged there. One of them gave me an awkward smile and said, "Looks like the HOA finally cleaned this place up." Clean this place up. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, but he looked completely serious. "You know this is my property, right?" I asked. He hesitated just long enough to make my stomach tighten. "Rebecca said the records were updated," he replied. I figured they sorted everything out. Rebecca Collins, the president of our HOA. Suddenly, every strange email she'd sent over the past few months came rushing back into my head. There had been vague comments about improving shared amenities and increasing community value, but I had ignored them because none of those messages mentioned my address or my land. Why would they? The pond wasn't HOA property. It never had been. I pulled out my phone and opened the county parcel map I'd saved years earlier when refinancing the house. The blue property outline wrapped perfectly around the pond exactly as I remembered. Nothing had changed, at least not legally. But standing there looking at that new fence, watching neighbors casually accept the sign as truth, I realized something unsettling. Facts only matter if people know them. And somehow, overnight, everyone around me had been convinced that my family's pond belonged to the HOA. I stood there with the morning sun reflecting across the water just beyond the locked gate, trying to understand how someone could simply place a sign on private property and expect the entire neighborhood to believe it. What I didn't know yet was that the sign wasn't the real problem. It was only the opening move. I took a picture of the fence, the chain, the sign, and every fresh post driven into the ground before I touched a single thing. Years of owning property had taught me one simple lesson. The first person who stays calm usually ends up with the strongest case. I walked back to the house, grabbed the folder where I kept copies of my survey, deed, and property tax statements, then headed straight for the HOA clubhouse. Rebecca Collins was already there, standing beside a folding table covered with coffee and pastries, as if it were an ordinary neighborhood morning. She smiled at residents as they arrived, shaking hands and pointing toward a colorful display board that showed future plans for what she called expanded community recreation. The moment she noticed me carrying my document folder, her smile faded just enough for me to catch it before she replaced it. With a polished expression, "Good morning, Daniel," she said. "I was expecting you." That sentence alone told me everything. None of this had been an accident. I placed my survey on the table without raising my voice. "Someone locked the gate to my pond," I said. "I would like to know who authorized that." Rebecca barely glanced at the papers. "The board approved a property adjustment after reviewing updated community records," she replied confidently. "The pond is now considered a shared neighborhood amenity." I blinked, certain I had misunderstood her. "Property adjustment?" I repeated. "You cannot adjust someone else's deed with a board meeting." She folded her hands together. "The legal details have already been addressed." That answer sounded rehearsed. Around us, several neighbors had stopped pretending not to listen. A few exchanged confused looks, while others nodded as though Rebecca's explanation made perfect sense. One older gentleman even thanked her for creating a place where grandchildren could fish. Rebecca accepted the compliment without hesitation. I realized that whatever story she had been telling the neighborhood had been spreading for weeks, maybe even months. She had not simply installed a sign overnight. She had prepared an audience. I slid the county survey toward her again, this time opening it to the page showing the exact property boundaries. The blue outline clearly wrapped around every inch of the pond. This survey was prepared by a licensed surveyor, I said. The county accepted it. My mortgage company accepted it. The tax assessor accepted it. Nothing here belongs to the HOA. Rebecca did not even pick it up. Instead, she reached into a binder and removed a glossy community map. The pond was shaded green, labeled Community Water Feature, with walking paths sketched around it that did not even exist. This is the current HOA master plan, she said. Residents have already been informed. I stared at the drawing. It was not a legal survey. It looked more like a marketing brochure than an official document. Yet people standing nearby leaned closer to study it, treating it like undeniable proof. I suddenly understood something. Unsettling. Most people never compare documents. They believe whichever paper looks more official. Rebecca continued speaking in the calm, practiced tone of someone convinced that confidence alone creates authority. We will also need your gate key, she said. Maintenance crews will require unrestricted access. For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. You want the key to my gate? I asked. Yes, she answered. It is now part of the common area. I slowly closed my folder. No, I said quietly. It is still my property, and I am not giving anyone access until this is resolved through the proper legal process. Her expression hardened for the first time that morning. The pleasant smile disappeared completely. Daniel, she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. If you interfere with HOA property after this notice has been issued, you will be responsible for the consequences. The crowd fell silent. I looked around at familiar faces that had waved to me for years, and for the first time, I could not tell who believed me and who believed her. As I turned to leave, Rebecca called out one final sentence that stopped me in my tracks. I hope you make the smart decision before law enforcement has to become involved. The next few days felt like watching strangers slowly move into my backyard without ever stepping inside my house. Every morning there seemed to be something new around the pond. A temporary trash can appeared beside the entrance. Then someone installed a wooden bulletin board with a cheerful notice announcing upcoming community, fishing mornings, and family picnics. By Friday, bright orange survey flags marked what Rebecca called a future walking path around the shoreline. None of it belonged there. None of it had my permission. Yet people treated it as though it had always been part of the neighborhood. The strangest part was how quickly everyone accepted the new reality. Parents walked their children toward the locked gate and pointed at the pond while talking about future activities. Neighbors discussed where picnic tables should go. One couple even thanked Rebecca on the community social media page for increasing property values by creating another shared amenity. I read every comment in silence. Not a single person asked the obvious question: who actually owned the land? That afternoon, I checked my mailbox and found an official-looking envelope with the HOA logo printed across the front. Inside was a notice titled Violation of Community Rules. According to the letter, I had attempted to interfere with HOA property by questioning authorized improvements and refusing to surrender access to the maintenance committee. The document claimed I had 48 hours to comply before additional fines would be assessed. I laughed out loud when I finished reading it, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd that my mind refused to believe it at first. Then I noticed the signature at the bottom. Rebecca Collins. She had signed it personally. I placed the notice beside my property tax bill on the kitchen table. One document proved I paid taxes on the pond every year. The other claimed I could be fined for standing near it. Looking at both pieces of paper together made me realize just how determined she was to create confusion. My wife, Emily, walked into the kitchen and quietly read both documents. She looked at me with the kind of expression that only comes after years of marriage. She knew I was angry, but she also knew I was trying not to let that anger make decisions for me. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. "Exactly what they are not expecting," I answered. "I am going to document everything." Over the next several days, I photographed every new sign, every temporary structure, Every email, every letter, and every conversation I could legally record through written notes immediately afterward. I downloaded county parcel records directly from the public website. I requested copies of previous subdivision plats. I even found photographs from family gatherings years earlier showing the same dock, the same shoreline, and the same property markers long before the current HOA board had ever been elected. Meanwhile, Rebecca continued acting as though the matter had already been settled. She sent another neighborhood announcement encouraging residents to enjoy what she described as their newly accessible community pond once final preparations were complete. Reading those words made something click in my mind. She was no longer testing boundaries. She was building public expectation. If enough people believed the pond belonged to everyone, anyone who challenged that story would look unreasonable. That weekend, I decided I was finished watching from behind the fence. Early Saturday morning, I grabbed my fishing rod, unlocked the side gate that still opened from my yard, and walked down to the dock with my teenage son, Noah. We sat quietly as the sun climbed over the trees, casting our lines into the same water where he had caught his first bass years earlier. For about 20 peaceful minutes, it felt like nothing had changed. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming, followed by quick footsteps approaching from the gravel path. I looked up and saw Rebecca marching toward the fence with her phone already in her hand, and an expression that told me she had been waiting for this exact moment. Rebecca stopped at the fence just long enough to make sure everyone nearby was watching. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, and several neighbors had gathered around the newly installed sign with coffee cups in their hands. She did not seem surprised to find me sitting on the dock with Noah. If anything, she looked satisfied, as though a carefully planned scene had finally unfolded exactly the way she wanted. "Daniel," she called loudly, making certain every person within earshot could hear her. "You are trespassing on community property after receiving formal notice." I looked over at Noah, who had stopped reeling his line and was staring at me with uncertain eyes. I smiled at him. "Keep fishing," I said quietly. "Everything is going to be all right." Then I stood up and faced Rebecca. "I am standing on my own dock," I replied. "Nothing has changed except the signs you put up." Rebecca lifted a thick folder in one hand and shook it slightly. "The board has already ruled on ownership," she announced. "You were informed several times. You have chosen to ignore official HOA directives." That sentence caught the attention of even more neighbors. People began drifting closer, whispering among themselves. I recognized nearly every face. These were people who had attended neighborhood barbecues at my house. Some had watched 4th of July fireworks from this very shoreline. Yet now they looked uncertain, caught between years of knowing me and weeks of hearing Rebecca confidently repeat the same story. One woman quietly asked another whether I had really lost the property. Someone else replied that the HOA would never make a claim like this unless they had proof. I realized Rebecca understood something about public perception that most people never think about. Confidence sounds a lot like truth when nobody has seen the evidence. She took another step toward the fence. "I am giving you one final opportunity to leave peacefully," she declared. "Otherwise, I will have no choice but to contact law enforcement." I nodded once. "You should only call law enforcement if you honestly believe I am breaking the law." She smiled. It was not the smile she used during neighborhood meetings. It was the smile of someone convinced the ending had already been written. Without another word, she unlocked her phone, pressed a few buttons, and placed the call on speaker. Several people instinctively moved closer to listen. Rebecca calmly identified herself, gave the address, and reported that an individual was refusing to leave HOA property after repeated warnings from the association. She described me as an uncooperative homeowner interfering with community operations. Listening to someone describe me while I stood 20 yards away on land my family had owned for more than 2 decades was one of the strangest experiences of my life. When the dispatcher asked whether the individual was threatening anyone, Rebecca admitted that I was not. When asked whether there was an immediate emergency, she hesitated before saying the situation required officer assistance because community property rights were being violated. After ending the call, she folded her arms and looked directly at me. "They are on their way," she said. "I hope you have thought this through." I simply reached into my tackle bag and removed another folder. Inside were neatly organized copies of my deed, certified survey, tax assessments, county parcel maps, and photographs documenting the property over the years. Noah looked at the folder, then back at me. Dad, he asked quietly, are they really going to believe her? I placed a hand on his shoulder. The first story people hear is powerful, I answered. But facts have a way of catching up. The distant sound of approaching sirens echoed through the neighborhood a few minutes later. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Neighbors stepped back from the fence while others pulled out their phones, sensing that something important was about to happen. Rebecca straightened her jacket, confident that the officers would confirm everything she had been telling the community. I looked down at the stack of official records in my hands, took a slow breath, and waited for the people who would finally have to decide whether a newly printed HOA sign carried more weight than a county deed that had existed for more than 20 years. 2 patrol vehicles rolled slowly onto the gravel shoulder beside my property, and the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The officers stepped out without urgency, taking in the scene before speaking to anyone. One looked toward the pond, the fence, the fresh sign, and the crowd gathered around it. The other approached Rebecca first since she had placed the call. She immediately launched into a polished explanation, speaking with the confidence of someone delivering a presentation she had rehearsed several times. She pointed toward the sign, referenced multiple HOA notices, and explained that I had repeatedly refused to comply with board decisions regarding what she described as a community recreational area. She emphasized that residents had already been informed about the ownership change and claimed my refusal to leave was disrupting neighborhood operations. The officer listened patiently without interrupting, occasionally writing notes on a small pad. When she finished, he thanked her and walked over to where Noah and I were standing beside the dock. "Good morning, sir," he said calmly. "I understand there is a property dispute." "Today?" I nodded. "There certainly is." I handed him the folder before he even asked for it. Everything I have is organized in chronological order. The deed is first, followed by the certified survey, county parcel records, tax assessments, and photographs documenting the property over the years. He accepted the folder with an appreciative smile. "Thank you for having everything ready." Rebecca stepped forward almost immediately. "Those documents are outdated," she insisted. "The HOA records supersede them." The officer looked up from the first page. "Ma'am," he replied politely, "do you have documentation supporting that statement?" Rebecca confidently opened her own binder and produced the colorful community map she had shown everyone at the clubhouse. She held it out as though presenting the final piece of evidence. The officer examined it for several seconds before asking a simple question. "Who prepared this document?" Rebecca hesitated for the first time since the officers arrived. "It was approved by the board." "Was it prepared by a licensed surveyor?" he asked. "It reflects the updated community plan," she answered instead. The officer nodded but did not comment. He simply placed the map beside my certified survey. Even from a few feet away, the difference was obvious. My survey carried the seal of a licensed professional, legal descriptions, bearings, measurements, parcel numbers, and county references. Rebecca's document looked like a neighborhood planning illustration with walking paths and decorative labels. One of the neighbors quietly whispered, "I thought that was an official map." Another replied, "I assumed it came from the county." Rebecca heard the comments and quickly spoke louder. "The board has legal authority over common areas." "I agree," the officer answered. "But first we have to determine whether this is actually a common area." That single sentence changed the atmosphere completely. For the first time all morning, the discussion shifted away from HOA rules and toward the actual ownership of the land. The second officer walked the fence line, comparing visible property markers with the measurements shown on my survey. He crouched beside an old iron survey pin that had been embedded near the edge of the path for years. After brushing away a little dirt with his boot, he looked back toward his partner and quietly pointed at the marker. They exchanged a brief glance that Rebecca did not seem to notice. She remained focused on convincing the crowd rather than the officers. "This individual has ignored repeated HOA directives," she continued. "He should be removed so the community can access the pond." The officer closed my folder carefully instead of handing it back. "At this point," he said in an even voice, "I believe we need to verify the county property records before making any determination. I would rather confirm the legal boundaries than rely on assumptions." Rebecca's confident expression faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning. She crossed her arms and said, "That will only prove what I have been saying." I looked across the water at the dock where Noah's fishing line still floated peacefully on the surface. I had waited patiently through signs, letters, threats, and public accusations. Now, for the first time since this began, the discussion was finally moving to the one place where opinions no longer mattered and only official records could speak. One of the officers stepped a few feet away from the crowd and contacted the county records office using the information printed on my survey, while the second officer continued comparing the visible property markers with the legal description in my deed. The conversation around us grew quieter with every passing minute. Rebecca had stopped speaking to the officers and had shifted her attention back to the neighbors, reassuring them that this was simply a procedural delay. She insisted the HOA had already completed everything necessary and that the county would confirm the board's position. Several residents nodded uncertainly, but the confidence that had surrounded her only minutes earlier was beginning to fade. The first officer returned after several minutes with a thoughtful expression and asked me one additional question. "Mr. Carter, have you ever sold, transferred, or granted any easement involving this pond?" "Never," I answered immediately. "Not even a portion of it." He nodded and made another note. Then he turned toward Rebecca. "Ma'am, can you provide a recorded document showing that ownership of this parcel changed from Mr. Carter to the association?" Rebecca opened her binder again, flipping through every divider with increasing urgency. Board meeting minutes, community newsletters, architectural committee reports, a landscaping proposal, copies of violation notices. She spread them across the folding table that someone had carried over from the clubhouse. There were dozens of pages, yet none of them resembled a recorded deed, a transfer document, or a county filing. "The board voted on this," she said firmly. "The decision is reflected throughout our records." The officer remained courteous. "Board records may explain internal HOA decisions," he replied, "but they do not transfer ownership of privately titled real estate." Those words landed like a stone in still water. Several neighbors exchanged puzzled looks. One man quietly asked, "Wait, a board vote cannot actually change property ownership?" Another neighbor answered before the officer could, "I do not think that is how deeds work." Rebecca immediately interrupted. "The community map was updated after legal review." "Who performed that legal review?" the officer asked. She hesitated again. "Our board discussed it extensively." He waited for another answer that never came. At almost the same moment, the second officer walked back from the property line, carrying a handheld notebook. "Every survey monument I located matches the certified survey," he said to his partner. "The fence they installed sits inside the parcel described in Mr. Carter's deed." The first officer nodded and looked back at the paperwork. "County records just confirmed the same thing," he said calmly. "According to the assessor, the parcel containing the pond has remained continuously titled to Daniel Carter since the original purchase more than 20 years ago. There are no recorded transfers, no recorded easements, and no filings placing the pond under HOA ownership." Complete silence settled over the crowd. Even the children playing near the sidewalk seemed to stop talking. Rebecca stared at the officers as though she had misheard them. "That cannot be correct," she said. "Our records clearly identify it as a community area." The officer gently placed her community map beside my deed once more. "Then your records are inconsistent with the county land records," he explained. "Property ownership is determined through legally recorded documents, not neighborhood planning materials." Rebecca looked from the officers to the neighbors who had trusted her, then back at the sign hanging on the newly installed fence. For the first time since this entire situation began, she had no immediate response. The confident certainty that had carried her through every meeting, every letter, and every public accusation disappeared beneath the weight of a single verified fact. The pond had never belonged to the HOA. Not for one day, not for 1 hour, not for a single inch of shoreline. And everyone standing there had just heard the official confirmation with their own ears. For several long seconds, nobody said a word. The only sound was the breeze moving through the maple trees around the pond. Rebecca looked at the officers as though she expected one of them to change his answer, but neither did. The first officer carefully returned my folder and said, "Mr. Carter, based on the records available today, this property remains legally yours." I thanked him, tucked the documents under my arm, and stayed exactly where I was. I had no interest in celebrating. I simply wanted the truth to speak for itself. Rebecca finally found her voice. There has to be a mistake, she insisted. The board approved this months ago. The officer remained professional. Approval by an HOA board cannot transfer ownership of privately titled property. If your association believes the county records are incorrect, that is a civil matter to address through the appropriate legal channels. Until then, the recorded owner retains the rights associated with the property. Those words echoed through the crowd far louder than anyone raising their voice ever could. One neighbor slowly looked toward the newly installed fence. So we were never supposed to be using this pond, he asked. Another resident held up one of the HOA newsletters she had brought with her. This says the pond is our newest shared amenity. The officer glanced at the paper before answering. I cannot comment on newsletters. I can only tell you what the recorded land records show. Questions immediately began coming from every direction. Who paid for the fence? Why were violation letters sent? Who authorized the signs? Rebecca tried to answer several at once, explaining that everything had been done for the benefit of the community, but her words no longer carried the certainty they had only minutes earlier. People were no longer listening because of her confidence. They were comparing what she had told them with what the officers had just confirmed. The difference was impossible to ignore. One of the residents walked over to the green sign hanging from the chain and quietly read it again. HOA community area, he said aloud before turning toward Rebecca. If this was never HOA property, why was this sign installed? She hesitated. It reflected the board's understanding. Understanding? Another neighbor repeated. You told us ownership had already changed. A small circle formed around Rebecca as more residents asked similar questions. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. They simply wanted answers. I noticed something important in that moment. People were not upset because the pond belonged to me. Most of them had never wanted my property in the first place. They were upset because they realized they had been given information presented as fact without anyone verifying it. The first officer looked toward the fence and then back at Rebecca. Since this structure appears to have been placed on private property without the owner's authorization, I strongly recommend that the association address the situation promptly. It was not an order. It was calm advice. But everyone understood exactly what it meant. Rebecca slowly turned toward the fence she had confidently installed only days earlier. The symbol that had represented her authority had suddenly become evidence of a decision she could no longer defend. Noah quietly walked over beside me, looking at the crowd with wide eyes. Dad, he whispered, does this mean it is finally over? I looked at the fence, the sign, the neighbors, and the officers preparing to leave. Then I shook my head gently. The truth is finally clear, I said. Now everyone has to decide what they are going to do with it. As the patrol vehicles pulled away, the neighbors remained exactly where they were, no longer discussing community improvements or fishing events. Instead, they stood around the very fence they had accepted without question only a few days earlier, wondering how something so obviously untrue had managed to convince an entire neighborhood for so long. The neighborhood looked completely different by Monday morning, even though nothing physical had changed yet. The fence was still standing. The green sign still hung from the chain. The temporary bulletin board still advertised fishing mornings that were never going to happen. But the confidence behind those things had disappeared. As I drove to work, neighbors who had avoided eye contact the week before now waved awkwardly or nodded as I passed. Several of them stopped by my driveway that evening, not to defend the HOA, but to apologize. One couple admitted they had believed Rebecca because she always sounded certain during board meetings. Another neighbor confessed that he never imagined anyone would claim ownership of private property without verifying it first. I told each of them the same thing. You were given information that sounded official. I understand why you believed it. My frustration had never been directed at the people who lived around me. It was directed at the decision that started all of this. Later that afternoon, I met with a local real estate attorney and placed every document I had collected over the previous week across his conference table. He spent nearly an hour reviewing the deed, the certified survey, the violation notices, photographs of the fence, copies of Rebecca's newsletters, and the timeline I had carefully documented from the very first morning. When he finally leaned back in his chair, he looked at me and smiled. I am glad you kept records instead of reacting emotionally, he said. Documentation wins disputes. We discussed the options available to protect my property rights moving forward. He recommended sending a formal demand that the HOA immediately remove every unauthorized structure, withdraw every violation notice, correct all written communications claiming ownership of the pond, and preserve every internal document related to the board's decision. He also advised me not to remove the fence myself until the association had been given an opportunity to correct its actions through the proper legal process. It was exactly the advice I hoped to hear because I wanted this resolved correctly, not dramatically. The following evening, an emergency HOA board meeting was announced. Unlike previous meetings, the room was completely full long before it started. Residents lined the walls, carrying copies of newsletters, printed photographs, and handwritten questions. Rebecca entered with far less confidence than I had ever seen. She no longer greeted everyone with her usual polished smile. Instead, she quietly took her seat and shuffled papers that she never seemed to read. As soon as homeowner comments began, the questions came one after another. Who approved spending HOA funds on fencing private property? Why were residents told ownership had changed? Who verified the county records before the board acted? Why were violation letters sent to the legal owner? Each question was calm, direct, and impossible to ignore. Rebecca attempted to explain that the board had acted in what it believed were the community's best interests, but every answer led to another question. One board member, who had remained mostly silent throughout the meeting, finally admitted he had assumed legal verification had already been completed before the proposal ever reached a vote. Another quietly acknowledged that he had never personally reviewed the county records. The room fell silent again as people realized how many assumptions had been made without anyone confirming the most basic fact of all: ownership. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to suspend every planned improvement involving the pond until the matter was fully resolved. A committee was assigned to review the decisions that had led to the mistake, and residents requested that future board actions involving private property require independent legal verification before implementation. As I walked out of the clubhouse that night, I looked across the parking lot and saw Rebecca standing alone beside her car, staring down at the same community map she had defended so confidently only a few days earlier. For the first time since this ordeal began, it was no longer my credibility being questioned. It was hers. Over the next 2 weeks, everything that had happened began to unwind one careful step at a time. The fence came down first. A small maintenance crew arrived early one morning, quietly removing each post without the speeches or celebrations that had accompanied its installation. The green sign disappeared before lunch, followed by the temporary bulletin board advertising community events that were never supposed to exist. By sunset, the gravel path leading to my pond looked exactly the way it had for years. If someone had driven through the neighborhood that evening without knowing the story, they never would have guessed how much confusion those few pieces of metal and wood had created. A few days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice withdrawing every violation issued against me. The letter also confirmed that the association recognized the pond as privately owned property and acknowledged that future HOA projects would exclude my land unless I personally agreed otherwise. It was written in careful legal language, and while it did not contain the apology many people expected, it accomplished something more important. It corrected the official record. My attorney reviewed the letter, nodded once, and told me it was exactly the type of documentation we wanted. We responded with our own written agreement confirming the resolution while reserving my rights should anything similar ever happen again. That chapter was finally closed. What surprised me most was not the paperwork. It was the change in the neighborhood itself. People became more engaged during HOA meetings than they had ever been before. Residents asked questions that nobody had bothered asking in the past. They requested supporting documents before approving new projects. They read meeting packets instead of simply trusting summaries. They wanted transparency, not because they suddenly distrusted every board member, but because they had learned how easily confidence could be mistaken for authority when nobody verified the facts. Even Rebecca changed. Several weeks after the emergency meeting, she resigned as HOA president. I did not celebrate her decision. I did not ask for it, and I did not speak against her during the process. Everyone makes mistakes, but leadership carries the responsibility to verify facts before asking others to believe them. That was the lesson this neighborhood would remember long after the fence was gone. One quiet Saturday morning near the end of summer, Noah and I returned to the dock with the same fishing rods we had carried the day the officers arrived. The water was perfectly still. A blue heron stood near the far bank, completely undisturbed, as if nothing unusual had ever happened there. Noah cast his line into the water and smiled. "It finally feels normal again," he said. I looked across the pond, watching the sunlight reflect off the surface exactly the way it had every morning for more than 2 decades. "It always belonged here," I answered. "We just had to remind everyone of the truth." A few minutes later, one of our neighbors walked down the path and stopped a respectful distance away. He waved before speaking. "Daniel," he called, "I just wanted to thank you." I looked up in surprise. "For what?" He smiled. "For handling all of this the way you did. You could have turned the whole neighborhood against itself, but instead you let the facts do the talking." I thought about that for a moment because he was right. There had been plenty of opportunities to answer anger with anger. It probably would have felt satisfying for a few minutes. But satisfaction fades. Records remain. Truth remains. Property lines remain. Before leaving, the neighbor glanced across the pond one last time and laughed softly. "Funny," he said. "It looks exactly the same as it always did." I smiled and looked out over the water where my father had once taught me to fish and where my own son now sat waiting patiently for the next bite. The pond had never changed. Only the story people believed about it had. And in the end, no sign, no meeting, no confident speech, and no vote could ever outweigh the simple fact recorded on a county deed that had been quietly telling the truth all along.